Before we begin today's presentation, we would like to make you aware of other upcoming EPA research webinars on a range of topics that may be of interest to you. All of our webinars are free and open to the public. You can find more information about these webinars, including how to register, in the chat. Our next webinar in this series will occur on May 21st, and we will be discussing extreme weather events, and we'll have presentations on the impacts of extreme precipitation and urban heat island. And with that, I am pleased to pass it to Dr. Sherry Hunt from EPA's Air, Climate, and Energy Program, and she will introduce today's speakers.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Thank you guys for joining us. This is the third year of our webinar series, and it has been really great to see the interest and see the growth of people participating, because we continue to have a great set of researchers and science results to share with you. And so the Air, Climate, and Energy Research Program focuses on research to understand and improve air quality, to address the causes and consequences of climate change, and to protect public health and the environment. And with the recent increases in wildfires, we've expanded the research that we've been taking on in this area. And frequently we share a lot, we talk a lot about the impacts of human exposure to smoke and particulate matter from the wildfire smoke. These are just some of the ways that fire can impact your health and the environment. And so today, I'm really excited. We have two speakers to share some of the additional impacts that don't get talked about quite as frequently. We have two really amazing scientists. First, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Amara Holder. She's a mechanical engineer in EPA's Office of Research and Development, and she really can measure the emissions of almost anything. She focuses on combustion sources and their impact on human health and the environment. And she's really, in the past few years, done a lot to understand the composition of smoke from wildfires. And she's also done some really interesting work looking at lower cost methods to mitigate exposure to wildfire smoke. So you can check out some links to that either later in the webinar or on the EPA website. We also are going to hear from Dr. Stephen Leduc. He is an ecologist, and he specializes in understanding impacts on agricultural and forested ecosystems. And he's done a lot of work looking at the soil and water impacts of biofuel production, as well as the impacts of wildfires on the ecosystems. And so the two of them together are going to give us this really great overall perspective. And I am going to turn it over to Amara, and I'll see you later at the end.
Thank you, Sherry. Okay, thanks for having me here today. Good afternoon, everyone. Our presentation is going to start with an overview of wildfire and EPA's mission areas in this space. I'm going to talk about wildfire impacts on air quality, giving a bit of background on the smoke composition, and talking about some of the hazardous air pollutants that are part of that we've been looking at lately. I'll talk about the wildland urban interface fires and how they may differ from natural vegetation fires. And then I'll pass it off to Steve, who will take over talking about wildfire impacts on water quality, looking at the physical, the chemical, the biological impacts, their magnitude, their duration, and how they may lead to exceedances in water quality. And he will also touch on the impacts from wildland urban interface fires. Steve will then wrap it up with a look at emerging issues in this space, looking at smoke impacts and downwind ecosystems and how future climate may impact fire. So wildfire is a natural process in many ecosystems. We have ecosystems that are fire adapted, so they really need fire to thrive. Fire can provide numerous benefits, such as regeneration of new trees and plants, clearing out space so that these plants can thrive. They can create habitats that are important for different types of wildlife, like fish and large mammals may rely on fire to provide that habitat for them. There's also the role of fire in maintaining native biodiversity, as well as eliminating non-native plant species and keeping control of pests. Fire can also lead to an increase in light input to streams and stimulate aquatic production. So overall, fire can provide many positives in natural landscapes, yet it's been increasing in magnitude in the past several years, and this is driven in part by climate change. So we're moving into a new era in fire's impact. Now, EPA in this space deals with wildland fire. So that's a combination of both prescribed fire that's burned intentionally and wildfires that may be lit either by natural sources like lightning or unnatural sources like humans, but burn uncontrolled. Both of those fires impact EPA's mission areas. Now, the gains that EPA has seen in the past decades of clean air due to regulations of industrial sources are starting to be eroded by the impacts of wildfires. So EPA does not regulate wildfire emissions, but its role here is really to communicate to the public how to reduce their exposure and protect their health. EPA's mission area of water quality is also affected. So for example, increases in fire frequency can result in increases in runoff pollutants with drinking water standards. So one example compound is arsenic. So those are the two areas that we're going to be talking about today, but there are other intersections with EPA's mission. That includes carbon sequestration, post-fire cleanup, but really we're going to be focusing on the air and the water quality impacts in this presentation. So the reason why wildfire is so important of late is that it's been increasing in magnitude. So we quantify this through the area burned for each fire. And a good metric here is the annual acres burned. So we started keeping good statistics in the 80s, and we have a yearly count here in this plot. And what you can see is over the past few decades, we've seen a near doubling of the decadal average of annual acreage burned. We're not seeing a major increase in the frequency of fires, so about the same number of fires burn every year. There's a lot of variability in that, but it's the size of these fires that are getting much larger. So you will hear firefighters talk about a very large fire in the 90s of being 200,000 acres. Now it's 1 million acres or more are very large fires. So we're seeing really large areas of landscape that are burning. And when this happens, there's a huge amount of smoke that gets produced. So we've spent some decades looking at wildfire smoke composition. So we do know quite a lot about it. So there are large amounts of particulate matter that get emitted into the air when you have this sort of combustion. So some of the larger particles in there are ash, which is the inorganic fraction from these vegetation that gets burned. And then you also see some larger soot aggregates. For the fine particulate matter, which is the bulk of the smoke, that's any particle that's less than 2.5 micron in diameter, or PM2.5, that's primarily made up of organic components. So that is partially burned or reacted vegetation that then condenses into these spherical particles. You also see some soot being formed in the flaming parts of the fire. But in apart to the PM2.5 and the other particles, you also see a large amount of gaseous emissions. So we see compounds like carbon dioxide being emitted, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and perhaps thousands or hundreds of thousands of volatile organic compounds that get emitted along with the fine particulate matter. So some of these compounds are hazardous air pollutants, and they are emitted at lower concentrations than fine PM2.5. And so they haven't been as studied as much as fine particulate matter. So one of the reasons why we do focus on PM2.5 from wildfires is that it is the smoke pollutant with the greatest health concern. It's also highly visible. When you see a picture of orange skies, it's the fine particulate matter that causes the sky, the light, to be degraded and turn orange. It's also the compound that triggers the air quality alert. So this is an image here of the fire and smoke map from AirNow. And those orange, red, and magenta colors that you see, those are associated with the PM2.5 concentration. There's also health guidance that goes along with those different colors that are tied to the air quality index categories. And those are all based on PM2.5 levels. And that's because it has this pollutant has a very well-established cardiovascular and respiratory health effects. So we really know at what levels you might start to see impacts on your health. So our communication and our mitigation measures are really tied to fine particulate matter, but it's likely that they do not reduce the risk from all the constituents of smoke, especially these gas phase constituents that may be hazardous air pollutants as well. So that's what we're going to focus in on today. So EPA has a long history of studying the impacts of PM2.5 and ozone, which can be formed downwind from wildfires. So we look at this region right here where you're near the fire and the emissions are fresh coming off of these burning trees and shrubs. We can understand the composition of that smoke, and then it translates into the downwind areas. And we look at the PM2.5 and ozone concentrations in those downwind areas, either right near the fire or thousands of miles downwind. What we haven't done so much of is look at other species in that smoke. And so one thing that my colleague Byron Rice took on was trying to identify what compounds might be increased on days when you have a monitor that's impacted by smoke, to try and understand how these other pollutants might travel downwind and what their concentrations are. So Byron took a look at the ambient monitoring network that is operated by the states. And this is a map showing where those sites are across the Western United States. And these sites take samples of the chemical composition of the air. Now, because it's a resource intensive process, they don't take it every day. So some of these locations might take a sample 3 days or every 6 days or even every 12 days, depending upon the type of sample they're taking. So you really have to be lucky that 1, you're getting impacted by a wildfire smoke plume, and 2, that you were actually taking a sample on that day. And what he did with that data is he looked at samples that were smoke impacted versus non-smoke impacted. So just regular old ambient air quality on those days. And we did some comparisons of what we see in those samples. So these sites are color coded here for the years spanning from 2017 to 2020, which were very active fire years in California and Oregon. And you can see that some of those sites are shaded red, meaning that they really had a lot of smoke impacts during those years. And some of those sites are in the blue colors where they had less impact from smoke. So we had a pretty rich data set to look at here to understand what was elevated on smoke days. So this is one figure from Byron's paper showing the compounds that are elevated on these smoke impacted days compared to a regular day. And what we see at the top here are compounds like formaldehyde and acetaldehyde are routinely elevated on smoke impacted days over what they would normally be at that particular monitor when there's not being impacted by smoke. And that's not surprising because formaldehyde and acetaldehyde are some of the first breakdown products from the wood composition. So wood is made up of lignin, cellulose, hemicellulose, and when that gets heated, it starts to break down into formaldehyde, acetaldehyde compounds, and that continues as the combustion process occurs. So we're not surprised to see high concentrations of those. We also see benzene as elevated. Benzene is a typical component of any sort of combustion system exhaust. But we also see some interesting compounds that are chlorinated hydrocarbons. We see elevated manganese, we see elevated lead. And so these are other compounds that we haven't routinely measured in wildfire smoke, but that we are seeing elevated on some of these smoke impacted days at the monitors. And there is some basis for why these might be elevated from a wildfire system. We do have chlorine in natural vegetation. We do have lead in our environment, some legacy lead left over from when we used it in automobile gasoline. So it's not surprising to see these in the emissions, but so there is a fundamental basis for why they exist here, but it's not something that we looked at in great detail in the past. And these compounds may have important health consequences. So it's important to try and quantify what they might be in the ambient when you're seeing the smoke impaction. So moving on to that's just for natural vegetation, but when you have fires that burn into the wildland urban interface, so that's the area where humans and their development meet and intermix with wildland fuels, what used to be just the natural forest and the shrubs and the grasslands burning now turns into the urban materials starting to burn. And so that's when we think that we're going to see different types of compounds. So when you go, so what we've seen with these wildland urban interface fires is like the increase in annual acreage burned, we are seeing a big increase in the number of structures destroyed in wildfires. And that's how we're trying to quantify the activity of these wildland urban interface fires. Now, we didn't have good statistics before about 2005, so there's really just a flat line there. There probably were fires that involved structures at that time, but we didn't quantify that. But after 2005, we start to keep track of how many of these structures are burned in any of these fires. And we see a sharp increase in these very active fire years in 2017, 2018, and 2020. And part of this is driven by the increase in activity of wildfires, but it's also about human development spreading out into these natural lands. So that wildland urban interface area has been increasing over these past few years. It's an attractive place to live. And so more and more people are wanting to live out there in the natural landscape, which puts them at risk of being impacted by a wildfire. Now, when we look at these types of fires, we have to think about, well, what's going to be different when you are involving structures and vehicles in the fire as opposed to having a wildfire that's just burning trees? We took a closer look at what these urban fuels are that I'm calling them, and that's really the structures that man makes. So that's the house, and the vehicles are what's contributing to the fuel in these areas. So we took an analysis of what those fuels are composed of, and this is a picture from the National Academy of Sciences report. And it shows a breakdown of what a typical American home might include for the fuels. So by and large, if you look at the structure in many areas, it's made out of wood. So it's not very different from a tree. But when you start to look at the other components, that's where things start to get interesting. So you could have asphalt shingle roofs, so that has some interesting hydrocarbons involved there. Your furniture could be mostly wood, but it also has a large component of polyurethane foam to make those soft cushions. You have different types of textiles that could cover your cushions or your surfaces, like nylon carpeting or vinyl flooring. You have different types of household chemicals, paints, solvents, refrigerants, herbicides, pesticides, etc. So there's all sorts of different compounds within the home that may change the composition, the chemical composition of the fuel. And then if you look at the vehicle, you have something even more interesting. So instead of having anything made out of wood, you have a lot of plastics, you have metals, you have batteries, which can have a high amount of lead in them. They can have things like fluorine in them, depending upon like what type of battery they are. There's also different fluids that are part of the vehicle. There's rubber for the tires, their upholstery that's going to have that polyurethane foam. It's going to have different textiles that cover that foam. So there's really quite a lot that could be present in the urban environment that could contribute to some unique emissions from these types of fires. So what I wanted to do is try to get a handle on what we might expect. And so I did this exercise leaning on what is known from structure fire. So this is a very different context than a wildfire, but it's been heavily researched for the past few decades. And it's really looking at how people can get out of a structure while it's burning down. So it's a very different scenario. In this scenario, it's where the couch might catch on fire from a lit cigarette or from a space heater. And you're looking at one piece of furniture that's burning. It's burning on the inside of the structure, not the outside of the structure. And there's really this focus on acute toxic emissions. So these are things, compounds like carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide, because those are the compounds that will kill a person first. We're trying to understand how quickly can a person get out of that burning building and still survive. Now, these studies have looked at different types of emission amounts, and they have looked at other types of compounds, but there's really not a lot of data. But what they have observed is that there are emissions from including PM2.5, there's different volatile organic compounds, there's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs that get emitted, dioxins and furans, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, flame retardants, acid gases, and toxic metals like arsenic, lead, copper, chromium are emitted from these fires. So we know that the chemical composition from a structure fire does look quite different from a wildfire. And so what I did is I took that information and developed some comparisons. So we looked at the emission factor. So this is the amount of a compound that's being emitted per unit mass of fuel that's being burned. And we compared this natural vegetation that you would see in a wildfire versus the chemicals component of an urban area, the electronics component, so your TVs, your computers, or your wiring, the house components, that could be your furniture, that could be your structure, and the vehicle components, which could be a dashboard or a car seat or even an entire car itself. And we did a comparison across these different categories, looking at different types of pollutants. So on the left side of this panel, what you see is the total particulate matter being emitted from these different types of fires. And PM is a criteria EPA pollutant. What we see on this data is showing that there's really not a big difference between the different types of fires. They're about on par with each other, in the range from about 100 to 200 gram per kilogram of PM is being emitted for any of these fires. If you look at a compound like formaldehyde, which is a known breakdown product from the combustion of wood, you do see that that's elevated from the vegetation type wildfire, and it's not as high from fires involving electronics or vehicles. But if we move to the final panel on the right-hand side for a compound like dioxins, we see that there's very minimal amount of dioxins being emitted from that natural vegetation, but there are much higher levels being emitted when you're having fires that involve electronics or housing components or vehicle components. And that's because of the chemical composition of those fuels. They have the right atomic composition. They have things like copper and chlorine that help drive this dioxin formation in the combustion system. So we can see right away that we should expect very different emissions from wildland urban interface fires than what we've seen with these vegetation fires. And so if I translate that information to a larger scale, we can see the impact of that on the total emissions from these fires. So my exercise here is looking at several different fires within California over the years of 2017 and 2020. So I took those years because they were very active fire years. We had some very destructive fires at that time. And I also had comparison data from EPA's National Emissions Inventory. And I could look at all of the other emissions that were put into that airshed from other sources. So these would be like your refineries or your airports or the vehicles driving around. And that would be all of the emissions from those sources throughout the entire year, compared with the wildland fire, the vegetation component, which is just the trees and shrubs and grasses, and the wildland urban interface component of it. So that's the houses and the vehicles. Now these fires, some of them burned for a very long time, like the August fire, which burned for several months, and it burned over a very large area, but it didn't include many houses. So for that particular fire, if we look at the lead emissions are actually higher from the vegetative component, so that's any legacy lead in the environment, than it is from any of the other pollution sources in that airshed, which is not a very populated airshed, so that's understandable. There's not a lot of industry there. And there weren't as many houses burned in that airshed during that fire. So again, the lead is probably highest from the vegetative component here. But you can contrast that with the Tubbs fire in 2017 on the right-hand side of that figure. And we see that there's really high lead emissions from all the other pollution sources. And that's because the Sacramento airport is there. And aviation gas, which is used at that airport, is the primary input of lead into the atmosphere. So over the entire year, you see a fair amount of lead being emitted from the use there, but it's on par with the houses and vehicles that were burned in the Tubbs fire, which spanned only 2 weeks. So it's a 2-week period of lead input into the atmosphere compared to an entire year. And they're getting to be about the same level. So we can see that these wildland urban interface fires are potentially a very potent source of some toxic compounds into the atmosphere. Now, this has been an exercise. So we're just doing this on pen and paper, trying to understand what might be emitted. But when you look at the reality, we can go back to those monitors that Byron used in his study and look at those monitors again. So our colleague Katie Boaggio did this research looking at these monitors that were impacted by some of these fires. And this is a snapshot of data from the Point Reyes fire, the Point Reyes monitoring site that as it was being impacted by the Camp Fire, where there was a huge amount of structures, so nearly 20,000 structures and about 23,000 vehicles were consumed in that fire. So a large amount of urban materials were burned. And this is a remote site on the California seashore. There's really nothing going on there. It's not seeing any impacts from industry. So you do see very little lead normally there, but when it's impacted by this plume from the Camp Fire, that lead concentration spiked. And so we do think that that lead is coming from those burning vehicles and houses. And what she did is to take it one step further, and she looked at different types of fires. So she could go back to these monitors that were being impacted by the fire and take a fire like the car fire, where there's some structures involved, or the Tubbs fire, where there are more structures, or the campfire, which was a really extreme scenario where there are many structures and vehicles involved. And what we see is that there's this increase in some of these very unique metals that we don't normally see in the atmosphere. And what this is pointing to is that there's a unique fingerprint, a chemical fingerprint in the emissions from these wildland urban interface fires that we can pick up at these monitors. So when you have more structures involved, you start to see more lead in that sample, you see more copper in that sample, you see some really unique compounds like rubidium, titanium, zirconium, vanadium even being elevated at these monitoring sites that we don't normally see in ambient air. And we think that that's being derived from these burning structures and vehicles. And so this has some big implications for what this might mean for health-wise, and also how we might mitigate the health effects from these exposures. So it's a very active area of research that is ongoing. So with that, I will conclude my portion focusing on the air quality impacts, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Steve, to talk about water quality.
Thanks, Amra. So as you can see from Amra's presentation, EPA has focused on wildfires impacts on air quality for quite some time, many decades. But it's only really recently that the risks to water quality have also come into focus for us. As Amra noted, the area burned by fire is increasing in the US and many places globally. And we are now realizing that it also affects water quality. And this is a problem because, in part because many municipalities around the country get their drinking water from forested watersheds that could be impacted and are increasingly threatened by the risk of impacts from wildland fire. So thankfully for us, there has been an extensive history of studying water quality in burned watersheds by academic researchers and others. So typically after a severe fire that scorches the trees, we see high tree mortality. We see a reduction in what's called the forest floor layer. Basically the leaves and the soil have been burned. And so we see an increase in runoff of water, erosion, and leaching. And this is just a schematic of that. So what happens, the trees have been killed. We get, by the fire, we get a large precipitation event, and that is no longer intercepted by the canopy or the soil or the forest floor layer of the soil because it's been burned away. And so the energy of that precipitation translates directly to the soil, which causes greater erosion. In addition, you don't have the plant roots holding the soil in place or the forest floor holding the soil in place. So invariably, after a severe fire, we see increased erosion of material. Now, the soil contains many different chemicals. It contains metals like aluminum, iron. It contains nutrients for plants to grow, like nitrogen and phosphorus. And it also contains chemicals that could be there unnaturally from human deposits over the years, from human emissions. And so what we see is we see all of this material carried with the soil to downstream water bodies. We also see an increase in leaching to groundwater and to surface water. Again, the plant roots aren't taking up the material, so we see more of this material percolate down through the soil and eventually reach water bodies. I also want to point out that we, in areas where trees burn in what's called the riparian zone, this is the zone that's right next to the water body and that can directly impact the water body. If those trees burn, we also see increased erosion in the riparian zone, increased leaching in the riparian zone, and importantly, we see more sunlight reach the aquatic systems because it's not being intercepted by the foliage of the riparian zone. So those are just some things to keep in mind, what we see in a typical fire. And so building on this work by other academics, we conducted here at EPA, we conducted a review of studies. We conducted a meta-analysis where we examined the water quality impacts following fire across many studies. And this is published by my colleague, Mike Paul, and others. And the links in the talk and the full citation is at the end. And we extracted information from many publications on the physical, chemical, and biological changes to water bodies following wildfire. And we compared those to the unburned reference area or the condition before the fire as reported by that particular study. And then we recorded the magnitude. So not only like what happened, but how much of an effect was there, and also the duration of the impact. This is important for water quality managers to know, like, are the effects from fire going to last 1, 2, 3 years, or even more? So what did we find? Well, not surprisingly, after fire, we typically see increased runoff and increased higher flows in streams, especially following storm events. We saw greater erosion, which leads to greater sedimentation. So we saw higher sediment loads in these water bodies. The channel can adjust. That means as more sediment flows into the stream, the stream channel will change course. And then a really important for aquatic life, we saw on average hotter summer stream temperatures in areas that have been burned. And this is again because, in part, because of the oftentimes the riparian zone is impacted and more sunlight is reaching the stream or water body. So for chemical impacts, most of the times, most chemicals increased. We saw an increase in nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. We saw an increase in other cations like calcium. We saw increases in metals and increases in organic compounds like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Changes in pH, which can be important for water quality, we found a great deal of variation, and it tended to vary depending upon the underlying geology and the soil properties of the site. Importantly, also for water quality, we saw a significant increase in disinfection byproducts. And these are compounds that form when disinfectants like chlorine are introduced to the water and they react with organic matter that's in the water. So we saw an increase in both actual concentrations of DBPs in the treated drinking water at drinking water facilities. And we also found studies that reported a higher potential for DBPs to form if chlorine was introduced to water extracted from burned sites. And DBPs have potential health effects they can increase chronic exposures to DBPs can increase the risk of some cancers. Biological impacts, we saw a lot of short-term biological impacts. We saw declines in diversity, in the number and distribution of species, and the number of organisms following fire. We saw fish diversity decrease and macroinvertebrate diversity decrease. And this mostly happened following the first big precipitation event after a fire. So when we got these erosive events, we saw declines in both the diversity and abundance of species. We saw a variable response in algae, and this is important because algal growth can lead to low oxygen conditions in the water column or hypoxia, which can affect aquatic life. It can lead to greater organic matter and disinfection byproduct formation. And it also, in certain cases, algae can release cyanotoxins, which is a concern for both drinking water and recreation. And so we tended to see a variable response depending on whether the riparian zone was impacted or not. As I said, we also recorded the duration of impacts. Thankfully, most responses lasted less than 5 years on average. So this was important information for our stakeholders. But in some cases, the response did last longer. In the case, for example, after the Hayman fire in Colorado, we saw elevated nitrogen levels in streams, or Rhodes et al. Found elevated nitrogen levels in streams for over a decade. And this was because the trees just failed to reestablish on this burn site. And we actually think that because trees are a sink for nitrogen, if they don't regenerate, we could see longer term impacts to water quality. And climate change could make this more common if severe fires plus dry, hotter conditions make tree regeneration more problematic in some locations in our western states. Now, we also saw some studies that reported exceedances or violations of drinking water standards following fire. And this was mostly the case for, we found select cases for nitrogen in the form of nitrate, arsenic, DBPs, and some volatile organic compounds like benzene. We saw exceedances in the treated drinking water itself. And this research was led by a colleague of mine, Michael Panino. And as part of this research, he found a number of cases of violations for regulated drinking water systems after fire. And this map here, the red locations shows where that drinking violation occurred. And the gray shows the location of the wildfire. So we found, as part of this research, we found an increase in nitrogen in surface and groundwater, disinfection byproducts in surface water, arsenic in groundwater, and volatile organic compounds in surface and groundwater. And on average, the violation rate was about 14% or more higher in wildfire burned areas compared to reference conditions. So thus, in summary, we know a lot about the water quality effects in burned watersheds, thanks to a lot of researchers who have been studying this problem over many years. However, as Amro was talking about, there are emerging issues that we just don't know a lot about yet, and by definition. So fires in the wildland urban interface, or WUI, is an issue that is an emerging water quality issue. So not only is it an emerging air quality issue, but we're also seeing water quality problems following these fires. For example, following the Tubbs fire in 2017 and the Camp Fire in 2018 in California, returning residents noticed odors from their tap water in unburned homes. So their homes actually survived the fires, but they returned to them and they reported this gasoline type smell. Well, an investigation found elevated levels of benzene and other VOCs in the tap water, likely due in part to damaged plastic water pipes. And the damaged pipes had caused contamination that had spread through the drinking water system. And it ultimately, to make a long story short, the system required flushing and replacing some of the parts to treat this problem. We also know that ash from destroyed homes and vehicles contain metals and many other chemicals. And the precipitation events after these fires can lead to runoff of chemicals into nearby water bodies. And again, this is just a completely new research that's coming out. A new paper that just came out this year found elevated metals in local creeks following the Camp Fire in 2018. And some of the metals that they found were chromium, copper, nickel, lead, and zinc. So many of the chemicals that are also seen in air quality samples downwind from WUI fires are also seen in water quality samples downstream from these burned urban areas. One area also of ongoing research for WUI fires is screening ash for PFAS. And this research is being led by Seth Newton at the EPA, and he'll be on afterwards to answer questions. But the hypothesis was that household products can contain PFAS and may leave PFAS in ash after being burned. They took three ash samples from the Marshall Fire in Colorado in 2021, and they screened them for PFAS using two analytical methods. In short, they did not observe any PFAS in the ash samples that they tested. And the detection limits are quite low for these methods. And so they would probably see PFAS if it was indeed in the ash. But with very few samples, they still need to take more samples or a homogenized composite sample to fully explore whether PFAS is indeed in ash or not. So this is an area of ongoing research right now at EPA. Another emerging issue is we know very well the local effects of water quality in burned watersheds, but what are the effects on ecosystems from downwind from fires that are 10, 100 or even 1,000 kilometers downwind from these fire epicenters, but that are affected by smoke. Human health has been a focus, the human health effects of this smoke, but we really haven't looked at the ecosystem effects of that smoke. And we recently published a review article, Paul et al., where we reviewed the literature and we found a lot of knowledge gaps because this is just an emerging topic. One area that has received some additional research are nutrients transported by smoke. And there is concern that these nutrients could have harmful effects on downwind ecosystems. So this was a research paper started by a colleague of mine here at EPA, Nicole Olson, and she looked at nutrients in smoke at monitoring sites across the Western US. And the data showed that there is indeed a higher nutrient content on wildfire smoke impacted days than non-impacted days. And indeed, some of these nutrients like phosphorus, calcium were quite elevated during select smoke events, even 10,000% or more in the smoke compared to just regular non-smoke impacted days. And we observed cases where algal blooms happened where the smoke intersected downwind lakes. And the hypothesis is that these nutrients may be being transported to downwind lakes and reservoirs and may be stimulating algal blooms. Now, all these events, there were about a dozen events, and they all occurred in late summer when water temperatures were already warm. But we really didn't have enough cases to say definitively yes or no whether this is an effect of the nutrients in the smoke. So now we are surveying lakes, many, many more lakes across the US for this phenomenon. So it's important to understand these problems and issues because they are not going away. This is a figure newly released from the 5th National Climate Assessment that depicts the projected increase in the number of days of extreme weather conditions conducive to very large fires. And what we see is that almost everywhere in the lower 48 states, we expect the number of days conducive for very large fires to increase in the coming decades. So these problems are definitely not going away. So PM2.5 remains the focal health consideration of researchers and health professionals, yet there are certainly other effects that wildfire has on both air and water quality. And as we've talked about today, some of these impacts are well established, like sediment and nutrient loadings in burned watersheds, and some are emerging, like the mobilization of pollutants, both in air quality samples and in water quality samples from the burning of infrastructure in wildfires. We expect these effects to increase with ongoing and future climate change. And we are studying this because we think more information on the total impacts of wildfire can help inform and support communities in their response to wildfire events. So thank you for your attention today. Thank you to the Air, Climate, and Energy Program for funding and supporting the work shown today. Amara and I wanted to thank many of our co-authors, and the publications that we cited today are all listed on this page with the ones supported by ACE in bold. And here is our contact information, and then I'll turn it back over to Sherry. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. That was excellent. And thank you, Amara. If you guys can put your cameras back on, there have been a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to try to skip over ones that I think you may have answered later in the talks, and we'll see how many of these we can get through. I'm going to start with one for Amara. There were a couple people asking about if you know whether there are contaminants of mercury, or if you can talk any more about lead. You mentioned lead in some of your ash samples. Is that oxidized lead? Do you have any information about what form it's in? And kind of related to that, when you're looking at the structural fires, have you considered things like metal roofs and asbestos?
Yeah, so there's not enough data to really answer these questions properly. Definitely mercury is there. Mercury is one of those compounds that kind of gets cycled in the environment. It gets emitted from other sources, it deposits, it burns, it gets re-emitted. We think something similar is happening with lead, and that's why we see it in natural vegetation. It was emitted into the environment, it's there, it gets taken up to some small amount by vegetation, it burns, it gets emitted again. What we don't know, particularly for lead, is what the speciation is. We know it's there, so we've measured it, usually with an ICP-MS type method, but we haven't done speciation measurements to look at, well, is it oxidized, is it a carbonate, etc. And those are measurements that we'd like to do in the future to better understand where it will end up in the environment. So we're hoping to get more data on that. As far as those other components of structures, there's a lot of unknowns on that front as well. We know that asbestos was a pretty common building material, and it's there. It's also part of the natural environment. In some fires that occur where you have soils that contain asbestos, that's a concern for suspending that up into the air, especially for firefighters that might be breathing there. We don't have any measurements of asbestos, as far as I know, near fires. So I wouldn't be able to say what the concentrations might be like for asbestos. Again, with the metal roofs, we definitely see that those are there. I love seeing the pictures of like a metal roof on the ground and the structure's gone in these post-fire pictures. And I just wonder what happened to the metal and how much of that might have been liberated by the fire and how much is still there. We just really don't know at this point. So unfortunately, no good answers for you.
Thanks, Amara. I appreciate your perspective, though, because that's good to know that these are questions that we're working on, and hopefully we'll get some data in the next few years to be able to address them better. There are a couple of questions about different kinds of fires, and I'm wondering if, I think this is really for both of you, if you can talk a little bit about prescribed fires versus cultural burning versus wildfires, and how different characteristics of fires, like the either the size of the fire or the temperature that the fire is burning, how does that impact any of the things that you've talked about today?
So I might start out here and then I'll pass it to Steve to talk about the other impacts. So for air quality purposes, I don't think we have a very good understanding of the different levels of intensity that might be seen in a prescribed fire versus cultural burning. We don't, as far as I know, have a good quantification of the intensity difference between a wildfire and prescribed fires or other controlled burns. One thing that we do know is that there can be a much larger amount of fuel that's consumed in a wildfire than what you would see in a prescribed fire. So the downed trees, logs, etc., those might be consumed in a wildfire where they would not be burned in a more controlled situation or more controlled burn. And that has big implications for the smoke. So you get a lot more smoke when there's a lot more fuel being burned. They can also be more smoldering. This is an active area of researchers trying to understand the impacts of intensity on both the fuel consumption side of things, which is what I started out talking about, but also on the emission side of things. So we do know that more intense burns where you have more flaming, you get a different mix of chemicals emitted during that type of combustion than you do with a cool fire that's more smoldering. And so there's different parts of this puzzle. We know they're different. We don't have great quantification of how different they are and what that magnitude is. So with that, I'll pass it to Steve to talk about the other impacts.
Yeah, so on water quality, I really talked about wildfire because many of these effects that I talked about are not seen with prescribed fire, at least if it's done correctly. I talked about how if the trees are killed and we get more erosion, well, if it's a light ground fire, usually we do not see water quality impacts anywhere near the amount that we do see in a more severe wildfire. So fire severity, the degree to which the vegetation is killed and burned, makes a big difference in terms of water quality impacts. I would say what we don't know is that we know on a per area basis that wildfire has much higher water quality impacts than prescribed fire. What we don't know is, well, if we have how much prescribed fire can one watershed take before we see impacts. So it's kind of that cumulative impacts question that really is the frontier for that. Like if we have to burn a lot to mimic wildfire, maybe we would see more of these effects. But on a per area basis, severe wildfire has much higher water quality effects than prescribed fire.
Thank you both. It is right at 4 o'clock. There's so many questions. Do you guys have time to answer one or two more? Okay, great.
Sure.
There are several people asking questions about, what can I do about this? And so I'm wondering if some people are asking, what can I do to make sure there's okay water quality after a fire? What if I have a well? Can I plant native species? Will that help avoid these fires? Will it impact the populations of different animals? And so I'm wondering if you could talk about if there's, I know we've talked, Amra maybe can talk about some of the things you can do to protect your personal health during a wildfire situation. But I don't know, Steve, if you can say anything about, are there things that we can do to help address wildfire impacts to the ecosystem and water bodies? So maybe we'll go to Steve first.
Yeah, so I think what's being developed are our research is informing that, but guidances for states, municipalities, what to test for after wildfire occurs in a certain community. So for example, like I brought up the benzene example, that is now on many people's radar now to test for. It wasn't prior to this, prior to research following the Tubbs and campfire. So these lists of chemicals to potentially test water for are being developed, are starting to be implemented by municipalities. And a lot of the lessons learned from some of these very unfortunate and tragic events are informing how communities can better protect themselves. For example, water treatment plants need to be protected alongside other critical infrastructure. And so lessons like that are being learned from cases like the Marshall Fire, from the Camp Fire. And so I would say, like, I think our knowledge is now being translated to communication pieces for municipalities and other public health agencies around the country.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Amra?
Yeah, so I think from the human health perspective, one of the major pieces of guidance that we provide is to go indoors, close your windows, close your doors, use an air cleaner. Using an air cleaner is probably the best thing you can do to remove the particulate matter from the air, to stop breathing that in. Many of these components or these compounds that I talked about today, especially the metals, are going to be in that particulate matter. And so that's probably the first line of defense when we're looking at a more exotic smoke composition. You would use that air cleaner and hopefully protect yourself from many of those compounds. What's not well known at this moment, and what's really the frontier of new research, is understanding how these air cleaners, which do advertise removal of organic compounds, how effective they are at removing those organic compounds. And are they going to be effective for removing the organic compounds that may vary in composition from these different types of fires? So air cleaners may often target formaldehyde because that's a common indoor air pollutant. But are they going to be effective at reducing benzene? That's a good question. We need that answer. Are they going to be effective at reducing the chlorinated hydrocarbons that we see from some of these types of fires? Another really good question. And so we've done some research here that we're hoping to wrap up soon, talking about or looking at this problem of what of the organic compounds are being removed. And I know other researchers are actively working on this as well. But I think there needs to be a lot more focus on the gas phase components of wildfire smoke, both from vegetative and these WUI fires, and understand if these air cleaners can be relied upon that. And if not, we need to start looking at what the alternatives are or how to kind of spur innovation in that area.
Thank you both. I just want to ask one more question because several people have mentioned the fire that was in Maui, Hawaii, a couple years back. It was pretty tragic. And, are there particular, issues around that? Do you or know of anybody who's analyzing the samples there or have any wisdom to share about what we need to be looking at to understand the impacts or to potentially prepare for a similar situation? And I guess one of the other questions related to that was about if you think about volcanic fire and volcanic ash and how that might be different from the fire that occurred. That's a lot. Steve, do you want to go first?
Oh boy, have not thought about volcanic ash, volcanic fire. I will say that we have talked to people on the ground in Hawaii, or did after the tragic fire in Maui. Don't really have, don't want to get into the specifics, but we have talked to our regional partners, Region 9, about that particular case, but I have not looked at like volcanic ash or fire. So I don't know, Amra?
So I've not looked at volcanic ash. I do know colleagues in USGS that have been measuring ash from fires, or not from fires, from volcanoes in Hawaii, and they've been doing it for multiple years now. So they do have research looking at the composition of the ash. I'm not sure how it may differ from the fires on Maui. I think one of the challenges that we face is capturing some of the emissions as they're occurring. We know that lots of people were there trying to evacuate at the moment that it happened. Nobody's setting up monitors at that moment trying to capture what's coming off from that fire. So it's really hard to get the smoke when it's at its highest concentration. What the focus has been in the tail end is really looking at what's off-gassing. And so that's after the fires disappeared, you have all of this debris there, and it has an odor. It's a very distinctive odor. And trying to understand what that is composed of, because that's an exposure too, and an important one because there's many people that are in cleanup mode there. And the question is, what proper protective equipment do you need to wear during a cleanup mode, especially for respiratory? And so that is an area that I do know some research have been focused on. They looked at the Marshall Fire emissions. And I think some other, if not the same groups, have been looking at the emissions coming off those off-gassing materials in Maui as well. And so I think we should be seeing more data on that front soon and get a better handle on how we can protect ourselves when we're in cleanup mode.
Great. Thank you. I really appreciate you guys sharing so much knowledge with us. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. Our scientists don't know all the answer to all the policy questions and all the advice and public health questions. Their job is really to study the situation, give us some solid and information that we can trust so that we can figure out how are we going to make a decision and what are we going to do. And so I think you can see that they provided a lot of information. And one thing I love is when they don't know the answers, they tell us they don't know it and they say, here's how we can solve these. So as long as we can find some resources to do some more work, we will keep on investigating. I thank everyone for joining us. As Elizabeth said at the beginning, our next webinar in this series is going to be in May on extreme events. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Amra. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Seth, for the work that you did on the PFAS. Even though it's a negative results, it's really important to hear those negative results because then we know that somebody investigated that question. So thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.